August 27th, 1782. The Revolutionary War is over. Everyone knows it. Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown 10 months ago. Peace talks are happening in Paris. The fighting has stopped except in one place. On a hot and humid South Carolina morning along the QA River. A 27-year-old lieutenant colonel leads a patrol of just 15 men toward a British group searching for food. His name is John Loren. In less than an hour, he will be dead. Killed in what history will call one of the most pointless small battles of the entire war. But here's what makes this tragedy so heartbreaking. John Loren was not just another officer. He was the man who could have changed everything. The abolitionist who fought to arm enslaved people and give them freedom. The visionary who imagined a different America. The warrior poet who wrote letters about equality while charging at British lines with a sword. And he died for absolutely nothing in a fight that did not need to happen, for a war that was already won. This is the story of the revolutionary hero history forgot. The man who was fighting two revolutions at once, and the cruel irony of how America lost its best chance for immediate freedom for enslaved people because one brilliant young officer could not stay away from one last meaningless fight. Welcome to History USA, where we uncover the forgotten heroes who shaped America's greatest battles. Today's story is not just about military genius or bravery on the battlefield, though John Lawrence had both in great supply. This is about something far more rare. A man born into wealth and privilege in 1754 who looked at the society that benefited him and said, "This is wrong, and I will burn my life down to change it." In a time when even most revolutionaries saw enslaved people as property, John Lawrence saw them as soldiers, as citizens, as equals. He did not just talk about it. He tried to make it happen, and he came shockingly close to succeeding. The story begins not in America but in London, in the rich world of colonial aristocracy. Henry Loren, John's father, was one of the richest men in South Carolina, a plantation owner and slave trader who had built a fortune on human bondage. In the 1760s, he sent his oldest son John to England for school, as wealthy colonists often did. The boy was brilliant, soaking up Enlightenment ideas during his studies. But London in the 1760s and 70s was experiencing something remarkable. The Somerset case of 1772 had just ruled that slavery had no legal basis in English common law, effectively freeing enslaved people on English soil. Abolitionist thinking was spreading through educated circles. Granville Sharp was publishing anti-slavery pamphlets. The very air John Lawrence breathed in London was filled with ideas about human rights, natural law, and the basic equality of all people. Imagine the conflict in his mind. This young man, whose entire family fortune depended on slavery, reading John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, attending discussions where educated men argued that slavery was morally wrong. Something opened up in John Lawrence's mind during those years. Or maybe something had always been there, and London gave him the words to explain it. By the time he was 20, he had become something almost unheard of in his world. A true abolitionist born into the slave-owning aristocracy who believed slavery must end, not slowly, not someday, but now. In 1776, as revolution broke out in America, John Lawrence faced a choice. He could stay in comfortable London, continue his law studies, remain in a society that supported his beliefs. Or he could return to America with all its contradictions and compromises, to fight for an independence that said all men are created equal while keeping hundreds of thousands in chains. He chose to go home, not in spite of the contradiction, but because of it. John Lawrence believed he could push the revolution to live up to its own words. He believed he could make America follow its stated principles. He was 22 years old, idealistic, almost to the point of recklessness, and completely sincere. He arrived in America in late 1777 and immediately asked for a position in the Continental Army. His father's connections helped. Henry Lawrence had become president of the Continental Congress. It's one of the most powerful roles in the revolutionary government. John could have taken a safe staff job, a comfortable position far from danger. Instead, he asked to be assigned. As a combat officer, he wanted to fight. More than that, he wanted to prove something. In the strict world of the 18th century military, personal bravery in battle was the currency that earned you the right to be heard. John Lawrence understood this. If he wanted anyone to listen to his bold ideas about arming enslaved people, he first needed to prove himself as a fearless warrior. He got his chance at the Battle of Brandywine in September 1777. The Continental Army was retreating. Washington's right side was collapsing under British attack. John Lawrence was serving as a volunteer at a camp to Washington himself. As British forces pushed forward, Lawrence rode straight into the heaviest fighting, gathering broken units and organizing rearguard defenses. A musket ball hit him in the shoulder. He barely noticed. He kept fighting, blood soaking through his uniform until the army had safely withdrawn. Washington noticed his bravery. More importantly, other officers noticed it. This wealthy young aristocrat was not pretending to be a soldier. He was the real thing. But it was at Valley Forge during that terrible winter of 1777 to 78 that John Lawrence found his true brother in arms. Alexander Hamilton arrived as Washington's aide-de-camp that same season. The two young men, almost the same age, both brilliant, both ambitious. Both believers in the highest ideals of the Revolution, formed an instant and powerful friendship. They shared a tent, worked side by side on Washington's staff, and wrote letters to each other that sounded like love poems. Historians still debate the exact nature of their relationship. What cannot be debated is that they understood each other completely. Hamilton, the immigrant from the Caribbean who had risen from nothing, and Lawrence, the aristocrat who wanted to tear down the system that lifted him up. They saw the same vision of what America could become. Valley Forge tested everyone. The Continental Army was starving, freezing, and dying from disease. Men wrapped their feet in rags because they had no shoes. They slept in rough huts with no heat. They had almost no food except what little they could find. Officers resigned their positions in large numbers, going home to their families. The army was falling apart. Washington held it together through pure determination, but even he was close to losing hope. In this trial, John Lawrence and Alexander Hamilton found each other. Both were on Washington's staff, working 18-hour days trying to solve impossible supply problems. Both were frustrated with Congress for failing to provide for the army. Both were impatient with the careful, cautious approach of older officers. And both were idealists who believed the revolution meant more than just freedom from Britain. They talked deep into the frozen nights, sharing a tent, discussing philosophy and politics and their dreams for America's future. Hamilton came from poverty and illegitimacy, always having to prove himself, always working 3 times as hard as men born into privilege. Lawrence came from wealth and status, but felt trapped by the expectations that came with it, wanting to prove that he rejected the values of his class. In each other, they found someone who understood the desire to be more than the circumstances they were born into. Hamilton wanted to rise above his birth. Lawrence wanted to rise above his privilege. Both wanted to create something new, something that matched the Revolution's promises. Their letters from this time show how deep their bond was. Hamilton wrote to Lawrence in language that seems extremely personal for the 18th century, even considering the more emotional style of male friendship common in that era. He called Lawrence "my dear boy" and wrote about loving him. Lawrence answered in the same way, writing letters filled with affection and longing. When they were separated by military duties, they wrote constantly, sharing their thoughts, their fears, and their dreams. Whether this was romantic love or a deep friendship is something historians still debate. What matters is that they were completely devoted to each other and to their shared vision of what America should become. And at the center of that shared vision was the issue of slavery. Hamilton had grown up in the Caribbean, where slavery was even more cruel and widespread than in the American South. He had seen plantation life at its worst. He had no false ideas about the system. When Lawrence began developing his Black Battalion proposals, Hamilton was his first and strongest supporter. Hamilton helped write the arguments, he helped improve the details. He added his own voice to the effort to persuade others. The two young men, barely in their 20s, convinced themselves that they could change history, that they could make the American Revolution live up to its promise of freedom for all. This time at Valley Forge, this winter of suffering and planning shaped everything that came next. The friendship between Lawrence and Hamilton became one of the driving forces in both their lives. When Lawrence went south to promote his proposals, Hamilton stayed north with Washington, but their letters continued. When Lawrence fought at Savannah and almost died, Hamilton was frantic with worry. When Lawrence was captured at Charleston, Hamilton worked desperately to arrange his release. It logically applied to all people, no matter their race. Governments get their fair power from the consent of the people. And if all men have natural rights to life, liberty, and property, then slavery was completely wrong. The Declaration of Independence, written just 2 years earlier, had announced these ideas. John Lawrence was simply demanding that America act according to its own beliefs. The fact that this idea was seen as radical shows how most revolutionaries had separated their thinking. They used natural rights to fight Britain, but ignored what those same rights meant for slavery. The response was mixed at best. Northern members of Congress were somewhat supportive but careful. They knew it would upset the South. Southern members were shocked. Even those who privately questioned slavery stepped back from such a bold plan. The slave-owning class in South Carolina and Georgia saw Lawrence's plan for what it truly was: a direct threat to their entire way of life. Think organized against it. Think whispered that young Lawrence had been influenced by European philosophy. Think he had betrayed his class, that he was dangerous. His own father, President Henry Lawrence, was stuck in an impossible position. He loved his son, who was also a plantation owner who had earned his wealth from the slave trade. He tried to soften John's proposals to find a middle ground. John refused to compromise. But John Lawrence had one important ally: George Washington. The general was careful by nature, conservative in his thinking, and a Virginia plantation owner himself. But Washington was also very practical, and he needed soldiers. In 1779, when the British shifted their focus to the southern colonies, Washington saw an opportunity. He sent John Lawrence south to present the Black Battalion plan directly to South Carolina. Washington gave him letters of support. He officially allowed Lawrence to act as his representative. For a short, shining moment, it seemed possible. Before heading south, though, John Lawrence had one more battle to fight. And this one would make his name. Known as one of the bravest officers in the Continental Army, in October 1779, a combined American and French force tried to take back Savannah, Georgia, from British control. The plan was a disaster from the beginning. The Allies launched a direct attack against strong defenses. It became a massacre. As the attack fell apart and men ran in fear, John Lawrence was in the front lines. He charged the British defenses with a sword, leading South Carolina troops in a desperate attempt to break through. The attack failed. Losses were terrible. John Lawrence fought his way back through the chaos, organizing the retreat and pulling wounded men to safety. Musket balls tore through his uniform. He survived only by pure luck. Count Pulaski, the Polish cavalry commander, was fatally wounded in that same attack. John Lawrence could easily have died there as well. The Battle of Savannah was one of the bloodiest, the defeats of the entire Revolutionary War. The British had strongly fortified the city during their occupation. The American and French commanders, General Benjamin Lincoln and Admiral Count d'Estaing, had surrounded the city for weeks, but the British defenses held firm. Running out of time as hurricane season approached and d'Estaing's fleet needed to leave, they chose a direct assault. It was a terrible decision. The attacking force had to cross open land, move through a swamp, and then attack prepared defensive positions. The British had artillery placed to create deadly zones. They had clear lines of fire, had soldiers trained carefully in defense. That attack began before sunrise on October 9, 1779. The plan called for several groups to attack at the same time from different directions, hoping to overwhelm the defenders with numbers and coordination. In reality, the attack turned into chaos. Units lost their way in the dark. Coordination failed. The French and American forces attacked at different times, allowing the British to focus their fire. The main attack struck the Spring Hill Redoubt, one of the strongest parts of the British defense. John Loren was with the 2nd South Carolina Regiment in the center of this assault. As daylight came and the attackers stepped out of the swamp, British artillery fired grapeshot. Men fell in piles. The American and French soldiers pushed forward anyway, driven by bravery, momentum, and orders to take the position at any cost. John Loren reached the British abattis, the sharpened wooden stakes forming the outer barrier of the fort. He was one of the first to reach it, sword in hand, trying to cut through or climb over the obstacles. British musket fire was deadly at that close distance. Around him, officers and soldiers were falling. Count Pulaski led a cavalry charge to support the attack and was shot from his horse, fatally wounded. The attack was clearly failing. Loren kept fighting and kept trying to rally the men for one more push. Some reports say he actually made it over the abattis and into the ditch below the British wall, one of only a few men to reach that far. The gunfire from the British position was so heavy that continuing the assault was impossible. The attack broke apart. Men began to retreat, some in order and many in panic. This is where John Loren showed his true character as an officer. Even as the attack failed, even as it became clear the day was lost, he stayed at the front, organizing the retreat, helping wounded men cross the deadly field, and keeping enough order so the British could not chase them and turn defeat into total disaster. He was exposed to British fire for more than an hour during the retreat. Several musket balls struck near him. His uniform was torn, but he was not hit. When he finally reached the American lines, covered in blood from helping the wounded but uninjured himself, other officers stared at him in shock. His survival seemed like a miracle. The Battle of Savannah cost the Allies more than 800 casualties, killed, wounded, or captured. The British lost fewer than 100. It was one of the worst defeats of the war, a complete failure. Savannah remained in British hands. French fleet left soon after, and the chance to retake Georgia was gone. For John Loren, however, the battle greatly strengthened his reputation. Everyone in the Continental Army heard about the young lieutenant colonel who had led the attack with a sword, who had been first to reach the British defenses, who had fought until there was no hope, and then had helped save lives during the retreat. His bravery could no longer be questioned. If anyone had thought he was a privileged young officer pretending to be a soldier, that belief ended at Savannah. John Loren had proven himself in battle, and he survived. And in January 1780, he arrived in Charleston as a lieutenant colonel, with a formal proposal from Washington himself: recruit 3,000 black soldiers, train them, arm them, promise them freedom, and use them to defend South Carolina from British invasion. The South Carolina legislature met to consider the proposal. This was the moment. If any state would accept such a bold idea, it would be South Carolina, facing a coming British attack. With Washington's support behind the plan, and John Loren, a native son from one of the most important families, making the case, the debate was harsh. John Loren spoke with passionate and powerful words. He argued military need first. The British were coming with overwhelming strength. The South Carolina militia could not be fully trusted. They needed trained soldiers right away, and the only group large enough was the enslaved population. But he also argued morality. How could they fight for freedom while holding others in chains? How could they declare that all men are created equal while treating hundreds of thousands as property? The contradiction was not only philosophical, it was a strategic weakness. The British were already offering freedom to enslaved people who joined them. If America did not match that offer, they would lose both the war and their moral authority. The South Carolina legislature listened. Then they voted. They rejected the proposal completely. Not a changed version, not a compromise. Total rejection. The reasons were openly stated. Plantation owners feared that arming enslaved people, even with freedom promised after service, would cause rebellion. They feared that black soldiers, once trained and armed, could not be controlled. They feared losing their property, their workers, and their wealth. They feared the social change that equality would bring. And beneath all the practical arguments was the hard truth. They did not believe black people were capable of serving as soldiers. And they could not imagine a society where black and white people lived as equals. John Loring was crushed. He wrote to Hamilton with words full of bitter disappointment. He had been so sure that logic and necessity would win. He had misjudged how strongly the slave-owning class would fight to protect their power. But he did not quit. Over the next 2 years, he tried again and again. He changed the proposal, made it less bold, and offered compromises. He spoke to individual lawmakers. He wrote pamphlets. He never stopped pushing. At the same time, he kept fighting. In May 1780, Charleston fell after a British siege, and John Loring was captured. He spent months as a prisoner of war, refusing British efforts to persuade him to change sides. He was later exchanged and returned to the Continental Army in time for the final campaigns of the war.